So my name is Sean Gibbs. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. What we'll talk about today is AVIcode, setting up and then deploying AVIcode into a SCOM infrastructure. We'll talk about standalone components as well as integrated components. With me, I have Chris Childers, who is one of my compatriots that came over with the AVIcode acquisition and merger into System Center Suite. And I also have Simon Skinner, who's one of our SCOM MVPs, that's going to help us out a little bit and talk about Operations Manager. I'm supposed to be paying $1 for every time I call it SCOM, which I'll end up doing a lot. It's going to cost me a lot. So let's go ahead and get started so I don't mess up my timing. So what we'll go over today is overall, what is AVIcode? We'll touch on mostly what I like to talk about is the architecture. What makes it up? What are the bits and pieces? Where do they go? How do you deploy them? And why should you care about how they're deployed? We'll talk a little bit about the different installation processes, configuring application monitoring, because one thing you'll hear me focus on, it's the data that's collected that's important. And how we're configured is how that data is collected, right? So I'll talk about that a little bit in detail. Some advanced options that we might have, I might touch on if we have time. They're typically not, that is. So what is AVIcode? Everybody here familiar with it, heard of it, seen it? Saw it in the tech? Okay, so I'm not going to touch on it too deep. Everybody knows it's an always-on monitoring solution. I always distinguish it between diagnostics tools and monitoring tools, partly because it's a pretty important distinction, right? Diagnostics tools are something you go in, turn on, point at something, find stuff, and turn off. Monitoring tools are something that are running all the time, always collecting data, always listening, always reporting, and allowing you to decide when things are important to work on or not to work on. What AVIcode does is end-to-end monitoring of the applications, in particular all the way out to the HTML in the browser. So we'll talk about how to configure and get that up and running. We call that end-user health monitoring. You hear the term end-user monitoring, end-user experience monitoring, all kinds of other things you might hear. We call that end-user health monitoring because what we're looking for is what the end-user's experience was when it was unhealthy and gathering that data. And what we'll talk about today is how to configure that collection and what decision points you have to make sure that you're getting what you want. So let's dive right into the architecture. So let's talk about what is AVIcode in the components that make AVIcode up. I think it's best described and easiest described as what most monitoring tools are, an agent-based technology. What we are is simply agents that get deployed out to systems that are running .NET applications. So in the slide that's in the far right upper corner there, you see monitored application servers, they get the agents. Down in the bottom is what's going on in the browser. Doesn't get an agent, gets some JavaScript technology we'll deploy to it. But in the center, what you're looking at are the web applications that make up the AVIcode core infrastructure, the main pieces that make up AVIcode. So there's the two web applications we have that are web user interfaces. That's the SE Viewer and Advisor. So that's what makes up what you're going to use for a graphical interface. Then there's the two web services that we use to collect data. That's the SE Log and the UX. UX standing for User Health. So those are the collection facilities that need to be deployed to collect data. And then we have our databases where we'll actually store these events. We call them structured events because we structure them. We're not just grabbing text. We structure them and make them important. So we call that the SE Viewer, to view those events. And then we have the management packs, and we'll talk about those, but those are specific to Operations Manager. So how do we take all that data we're looking at and collecting, manage that collection, and put that information into useful hands into the IT pros? How do they understand what it is and what's impacting their environments? And that's through those management packs into Operations Manager. And let me add this as I'm going. It's a small enough audience. Feel free to kind of speak up if you have any questions, ask. Don't hesitate while we've got it in your mind. Let's go ahead and find out. So what are the different deployment scenarios that you might be concerned about? some of the things that just like you would with any web application that you might be concerned about is the reliability of the monitoring solution. Collecting data needs to be reliable if you want to be able to answer to questions on a continuous basis and not have gaps. If you want to be able to present that data, send that data, so you need some reliability. Well, we're web applications in our infrastructure. Our consoles are web applications. So they can be easily load balanced. You can put them in a load balanced environment, report back to a single database, that's fine. Everybody will see the same data, just load balancing like any other web app. You can be clustered and managed in a failover system if you need to. So if you wanted to have some data or disaster recovery backup, once goes down in your production environment, that's fine. Have another one in the backup. That's not an issue at all. One thing that I didn't talk about, but in the previous slide I should probably bring up, is the management pack and the way that communicates is kind of a separate channel. Right? We're not talking back to these web services. These web services aren't talking back to Operations Manager. Our agents are talking directly to the SCOM components, or excuse me, Operations Manager components, and sending that data through that channel, right? So it's going straight back into Operations Manager.
It's $2.
$2
So far.
Awesome. It's got somebody keeping track. Which buttons are these? I keep flipping this around. So what do we do when we look at actually really deploying into a production environment where we have demilitarized zones and we have database servers that are accessible, but we don't have web applications going through HTTP accessible? And well, there are a couple of things. First, our communication, again, is HTTP, HTTPS. It needs to send that back to that web service I talked about. So, simply put, we can put one of those web services and SE viewers out in the DMZ. So it's an easy deployment. Let it talk back through the firewall through a database communication. We can also talk to an Operations Manager gateway. That's deployed out in DMZ, and that communication can come back through. In reality, in the 4 or 5 years I was with AVIcode, I never found an environment we couldn't deploy it. There was no architecture that confused the matters or really gave us a problem, because it's easy communication that we use and it's fairly redundant. One thing that is kind of interesting is where does our collector, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about that, but our collector for that user experience monitor get deployed. Because it's a web service that needs to be accessible to your end users. So if your end users are web-based applications are out in the real world, they're internet users, they need to have access back to that collector someplace. Best place to put the collector is a web service under the directory or under the application you're monitoring. Just a simple another request if we find an unhealthy event. Comes right back in. So we'll talk about that configuration utility that eases that installation for you. But you could put it anywhere. Take your load balancer, have it configured to listen to a URL, listen to a virtual directory, and redirect it someplace else. Virtually anywhere you want. Your limitations there are going to be into what the browser sees. So if you have one URL that they're coming to on your website for your web application, and the UX collector's on a different one, most browsers are going to throw up a cross-browser communication error. They're not going to like that, and they're going to warn the user that these people are talking to two places, which we all want them to warn us, but that's the type of thing you have to be concerned about. So what are the required architectures? We're going to go into a couple of different deployments, but I kind of like talking about what do you need at a minimum to get started. So if you wanted to go back to your office, get something cranked up, and get running right now, the minimum requirement is simply the SE Viewer and SE Log, which are installed with one MSI. So web application, we'll show you the requirements in a little bit, what that needs, and a database. After that, all you need is an application to monitor. It's the minimum requirement. That allows you to diagnose applications and start digging and developing and doing things. How many developers do we have? I didn't ask that, did I? Just a limited few? How many IT pros, ops? Okay. Developers tend to like that type of architecture very quickly, grab it, deploy it, hook it in, do some pre-production development and catch things and look at what it's going to do. That's a useful deployment because they can start seeing what their application is going to produce, and if the IT pros are going to put it into place into Ops Manager or into production without Ops Manager, it's kind of interesting to know in advance what is it going to be collecting. Is there any configuration changes we can do or should do? So it's a fairly easy infrastructure to deploy in that starting stage. The beauty part of it in its current version, 5.7, it is easy enough to simply add it into a operations manager environment. So if you deploy these minimum requirements today, and a week later, a month later, a year later, or whatever, want to install operations manager and integrate the two, you would simply integrate your existing SE viewer into the operations manager and let it start taking over. Any questions on that? I like to make sure at least I set that stage, because that architecture is kind of straightforward, but I don't want to confuse things when I throw the different terms out and different components. Everybody good? Yep.
Yeah, I noticed you have a couple of SE viewer items. One of those simply the database supporting the one on the right.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, because that is a little confusing. Two SE viewers, one's the web server application and one's the database, and then the SE log. Those typically are within the same environment, same system. So I think Simon can talk to us a little bit about maybe some of the installation steps that we go through and actually having this deployed and installed.
Hi. So I see there's quite a few infra people in here. What's just to throw a question out there? What's the interest for infrastructure with AVIcode? Is it generally the scenario of finger pointing, needing to know how to? Yeah, they're seeing a lot of nodding heads there. That's what it's about. Kind of resolves that problem. I tweeted it today that I was kind of asked if AVIcode was sort of like marriage guidance for infra and for dev guys. And DBAs. Oh, well, we don't talk to those guys.
we blame those guys because they usually don't come to the meetings.
Yeah.
Yeah, oops. Sorry.
Do they even put them in the same building? All right. So it's a two-phase kind of process. Currently, we have it in Operations Manager, and initially we have a standalone version of AVIcode. How you actually go about installing that is down to you. You can install that onto one box, multiple boxes, Sean's demonstrated. So we install the SE Viewer and the Enterprise.NET MP. I don't know if some of you guys saw in the earlier versions of Operations Manager, there was an ASP.NET management pack that gave us a certain amount of information. It's just kind of a very, very toned down version of what this product is. It was created by the same guys. It's going to ask us some questions, configuring groups, configuring server monitoring, importing some management packs for the UX, install the collection of web services. So as Sean was showing how actual architecture, this is the process of how we go about to install that. Configure the UX monitoring, configure the UX MP, and install the Advisor reporting. I don't know, any of you guys seen Advisor? Some pretty cool stuff, yeah. I think Chris has got some reports to show. So that's typically how it works in Operations Manager. As a standalone AVIcode, because you can use it as a standalone, you can use the two together as separate things. Infrastructure may be more interested in what it looks like in Operations Manager. Developers may be more interested in what it looks like in SE Viewer. It's a structured event, it's logical to them, they understand it. So initially we go through the process of installing the SE Viewer, configure the database, installing the agent. So it's pretty much the same as we were doing in Operations Manager, it's just there's one extra step in Operations Manager, that's to import it into the console. So to ensure a successful deployment, we've got to have our minimum requirements. This is what our minimum requirements like. So obviously we're probably all using a little bit higher than IIS 5.2, but I didn't even know there was a 5.2 actually. Is that on XP? So
Actually, that's
That's what it was, wasn't it? Yeah. SQL Server reporting services, and an ASP.NET, obviously. Then we've got to look at how we're going to secure that. That becomes kind of an important thing because, well, you know, sometimes, and I'm glad there's none in this room, or at least there's only one, but the database guys get a bit sort of touchy on this kind of stuff, how we're configuring their SQL. So we can actually work that out with them. We can put it into a Windows mode, so it's just Windows credentials. We can have a mixed mode, and we can facilitate exactly how that security works. So the database guys are going to be good with that.
What's the reason for SQL Enterprise for on the box itself?
Well, initially it's got to be able, when we do the installation of the database, it's got to be able to install that. I'm going to show you that because, in fact, what we can do is we can give you a script and say, you go do that.
Right, so it's just a grid of
Yeah, that's basically all it is, yeah. So installing the .NET MP at the top on the right-hand side. Let's just work that out. We have broken up what the actual management packs look like. That's the whole lot. So we've got the .NET, the Advisor, BizTalk, SharePoint, SQL Service reporting as well. Because BizTalk is a .NET application. We had that question there earlier on in the earlier session, how we deal with BizTalk, and we can deal with that with AVIcode. So this is how it looks to us. So we can select the AVIcode management pack, have the the AVIcode SE viewer if we want on the local box, and deal with the Operation Manager consoles. The Operations Manager consoles, you're actually going to have to run those on each management server, otherwise it's going to be missing that functionality. So to specify a fully qualified domain name, because wherever our installation is, it's got to be able to find the SE viewer. We put a fully qualified domain name in there because, in fact, we could have that reporting anywhere throughout DMZs, so we're going to need to have a fully qualified domain name for it to be able to resolve. Now, we get a couple of choices about adding to, automatically it will propagate to all of the Windows groups that have a SCOM agent on it. That's a buck, isn't it? Yeah, sorry. All the Ops Manager agents, or individually to servers. My personal preference is that we sort the servers we want, for example, the IIS servers, so we leave that configuration to afterwards, and then we can appropriate the right agents to exactly where we want to make our targets. Configure the XSLT files, or basically the files we're bringing into the database, and configure our SE database. Creates a database, creates a user, creates a connection string. I don't know if anyone used 5.7. One of the prerequisites was that is an actual encrypted database connection string now, so it doesn't appear in the web config file. So the AVIcode Advisor installation, we install the Advisor reporting, and then it's going to ask us to configure the database afterwards. So we've got the actual tools there in IIS, and now we need to make that configuration. So it's broken up on this screen here. We've got, for the reporting database, so that's going to be like SE Viewer DW. And then underneath, we've got the parameters and the configuration that we need to make for our SQL Server reporting, because that may actually be on another server. So we would add those credentials into there, and then that's going to be able to propagate the reports. So let's have a look how that's actually configured on here. Is it B? C. Alrighty. So when we've installed the SE viewer, then it's going to ask us to configure the database. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to add in my database. It's called test. Here I've added that I've got a user that I'm going to create for my SQL. This is obviously in mixed mode, or I could have that in a Windows integrated mode if I want to. I'm going to press test. It's going to test my connection. It's asking me, saying the connection's failed. It's pretty explanatory. That's because there isn't a database there yet. Do you want to configure that database? I guess we do, really. Then I can go and put in a username and password, this one's on the local box. I can then test for the connect to see if it connects. It's made a connection. So now I've got some scripts. If I open up these scripts for create the database, I could actually then just send these off to my DB guy and say, you deal with this, and when this is done, let me know. And then everybody's going to be a lot happier. Or alternatively, I can just press execute, and that will go off and create my database. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Simon. So what Simon just showed you, just to wrap up, is what he just showed you was a configuration utility. When you go through the management pack install, we have it in the slides, you're going to get a series of steps. Those steps are quite easy. You put in qualified paths and make some choices. Where we find that most people or most organizations get tripped up is in the database configuration. So at the end of that installation process, pops up this configuration utility that Simon was just showing you. Okay, and so if the person going through the installation process does have the appropriate SQL permissions to actually create databases and do all those things, they can go through that process there. What I'd like to walk you through is actually how we can go through the configuration process and actually set up an initial monitoring scenario. I am curious, since I didn't get up at the beginning, who's actually tried to install or has installed AVIcode? Anyone? A couple people? Okay, great. So for those that have actually installed, hopefully some of this you already know, and maybe we'll impart on some additional information. And then for others, if you do walk away and go through the deployment process, I think you'll find that this information will help you a lot. Once you go through the installation process, as Simon pointed out, during the install, you have an option that says automatically deploy the agent to every computer running in your Ops Manager environment, or choose manually. There really, except for maybe a test environment, is no good reason to pick that automatic. There's no reason why you want an automatic push. So you're going to pick manual every time. So what you need to do is actually then add your target computers in. And there's 3 groups, 2 core groups, a third optional group if you're doing the UX monitoring. So there's a discovery group, deployment group, and UX collector group. The discovery group, so one of the capabilities of the AVIcode management pack is it works in conjunction with the IIS management pack and will actually go out to every computer that's in the discovery group and look to see what applications are hosted in IIS, which .NET applications are hosted in IIS, and report that back. And you'll see it in action when I go through the installation process in just a moment. So you're going to add all the computers that you want to discover. Deployment group, self-explanatory. When we actually go to push an agent, only computers in that group will get the push. So again, probably 10 times out of 10, you're going to put the same computers in the discovery group as the deployment group. And then the last group is the UX collector group, and I'll let Sean talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the end user monitoring piece. So we have a series of templates that get added as a result of importing the management pack, and we can go through this add monitoring wizard process to discover the applications, if we're talking about web-based applications, or if we're talking about Windows services or client applications, there's a different discovery process. And then we go through a series of steps to configure an application and then ultimately monitor it. So as you probably surmised by now, there's the Ops Manager way of deploying the agent, which is seamless to you, and that is when we go through this configuration process and we target an application we want to monitor, if that computer's in the discovery and deployment group, and we set up to monitor an application, and that application's running on that host, then the management pack will take care of deploying that agent automatically and wiring up the configuration. There is the option to manually configure an agent, and this you would predominantly do in the case where maybe there was some reason why it didn't get pushed down, or you're setting up a standalone option. Yeah, question?
Item 2, the agent to which you refer is AVIcode agent.
That's correct. So the question is, what agent are we talking about? We're talking specifically about the AVIcode agent. Okay. And by the way, of course, all this is dependent on having an operations manager agent if we're using the management pack. There are some nuances to this whole configuration process. What I've just described up till now is all managed in Operations Manager. There is a different process for setting up end-user monitoring. And what it will require is for you to go to the individual web front-end hosts that require end-user monitoring and do some configuration there. That's option 1, or option 2 is kind of do a master configuration on one of those and then do a manual push to the others. And again, Sean's going to take you through some of the elements of the end-user monitoring piece. No, that's not the client. So just to be really, really clear about the end-user monitoring piece, nothing gets deployed down to the client endpoint or the browser. It's all basically dynamic JavaScript that gets injected into the response going out. So what we're talking about here in the install and configuration process, and it'll make more sense once we jump into the demos, is that to actually get the UX functionality up and running actually requires you to go outside of Operations Manager, go to the host or hosts that are your web front ends, make some configuration settings, which we'll take you through. And then if you have a web farm, then you can essentially you can take that as a master and push that out to others, because it's basically XML files under the covers. It's something like that, but it's not quite as API filters. It's actually hooking into the .NET runtime through a series of APIs to make that happen. So if you go down the path of a manual agent install outside of Operations Manager, it's quite simple. You go, I'll show you in a moment, go find the agent MSI. There's 2 versions, 64-bit and 32-bit. The installation process is quite simple. And then really the only step during the installation is that you have to verify that that agent has communication back to the SE viewer, HTTP or HTTPS. And so that's a setting you make during the install. Now again, if you're going through Ops Manager to do this deployment, it happens for you. Okay. I think I'll skip this for now. We've essentially covered things. So let me actually walk through how we get going with configuration. So Simon talked to you about setup. We understand the architecture. First thing I'll just point out, since we just talked about the agent install, if for some reason you have a need to do a standalone agent install outside of Operations Manager, just so you know where it is, one option you have, this is the install directory. This is what you get if you go out to Microsoft.com/AVIcode. So, and here you'll see this AVIcode Intercept Studio 5.7. The agent exists in here under agent, and you can pick either one. So you can put those up. So let's talk about configuration. So I'm in the Ops Manager console. First thing I'll just point out again is these discovery groups. So you see agent discovery or discovery group and deployment group. So just pop those open. You're going to add the target computers, and I'll tell you that discovery may take a little bit of time to go out and do. So if this is a production system, I'm sure you appreciate that there's some lag in certain things that we do in Operations Manager, so you may give it a little bit of time. To get an application up and running and being monitored, you'll notice, let me zoom in, notice we have a series of new templates. So we have specifically Enterprise.NET executable application, .NET Windows service, ASP.NET app, ASP.NET client application, and web service. So as you can guess from the names, based on the architecture of the application, that we're targeting, we want to pick appropriately. Okay? As I mentioned, we're going to focus on ASP.NET, but we do have those other architectures. Just note, for example, since there isn't automated discovery for .NET executables or Windows services, you're going to have to give us some criteria. You're going to have to give us Windows service name. Or for an EXE, you're going to have to give us either a path to the EXE or something in the registry to hang our hat on and go discover that on the targets. Okay? But once you give us that, then we'll go out to the target servers in the discovery group and look for that. But in the case of ASP.NET, let's go through this process. You can see I already have one set up. So we'll do add monitoring wizard. So we'll pick, drag this up, pick ASP.NET. This screen, when we click Find Now, here's what you're seeing. Here's the result of having discovery. So your list will probably be larger than this list because you'll have likely more in your environment. Here's all the IIS-hosted applications running in this environment. So I'll pick the Ops Manager Web Console, and you'll see this computer list. Probably a good thing to check, right? If you have 5 servers hosting an app, pull that up just to make sure you didn't miss something in the discovery group, right? So if I had this across 5 load balanced servers, I should see those there, if that's what I'm targeting. Okay, so we're going to pick an app. And then we can go through the process of saying, how often do we want to rediscover? So default is 240 minutes. This will give us a default management pack to put our overrides in, or we can create another place. I will give you a piece of advice right here. Don't make the mistake of running through this process that I'm taking you through for multiple applications and storing them all in the same MP for all the overrides. It'll cause you problems if you want to get rid of one of them. So best practice here, name it the name of the app that you're targeting and move on. Okay, this is probably the most important thing that you need to understand. Sean mentioned at the beginning it's really about the data, and this is your main toggles to produce the data that you're looking for. So let me zoom in. So top on the list, these first 2 thresholds relate to how we're going to collect and analyze performance of the application. So I always say that AVIcode collects 3 primary things when we're monitoring applications. We collect statistical data about the application and the host. We collect performance events. We raise events when the performance of our application exceeds boundaries that we've defined, and exceptions. When the application is thrown an exception, we capture that as well, and we do that in real time. So we need to define performance boundaries. One of the things that you should understand behind the scenes is we've done lots of R&D work on your behalf to define the configurations that say, you know, over the years, we generally know how that when you're monitoring an ASP.NET application, you want to measure performance by page versus a Windows service, which is going to be service invocation, right, or WCF invocation. So that all happens for you behind the scenes. We make some assumptions about what makes sense. You need to describe what's healthy and what's unhealthy. So one of the ways you can do that is set this alerting threshold. This right here will govern, you'll see the default's 15,000 milliseconds, 15 seconds. So what this says, since we're targeting an ASP.NET application, is any page request exceeding 15 seconds, we're going to generate an event, and we're going to collect diagnostic information. Yep, question? Yes. Yes. From a configuration point of view, we just collect it. Yeah. Got it. So the question is, you know, if I have specific pages in my app that I know, like I always use the example of our report. You know, reports take a minute and you know it. You don't, 15 seconds isn't going to work for that. But So the answer is yes, and literally right after this, I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so that's the alerting threshold. Everyone with me on that? And this applies globally. Now, another best practice. If you're standing this up and you're trying to understand and learn how this is going to apply in your environment, you need to understand that these settings we've set are pretty conservative, pretty high, because we don't want to set these low and have you put it in production, and we're flooding you with data. And why do I say that? So if you're standing this up in a test environment and your goal is to get familiar and collect a lot of data and understand, set these a lot lower, and then go through that refinement process. You can go back in, edit this, and change them, right? I mean, I'll tell you what I often go in. If it's a real low, test environment, QA environment, pre-prod environment, go in, set it, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. Understand where your problem areas are. Look at the events and alerts coming in, and then tighten those back up once you understand what you're dealing with. This sensitivity threshold governs the level of detail inside the event. So imagine page request, we have hundreds if not thousands of methods being executed in that page request. We don't necessarily want to collect thousands and thousands of 1 millisecond calls inside that make up that page request. That would be prohibitive performance-wise, and you don't care about it anyway. So what the sensitivity threshold does is says, we're going to filter out all that detail about a page if it doesn't exceed 100 milliseconds, because we're looking for chunks of problem areas. Okay. These other settings, by default checked on, is we dynamically create a series of performance counters about your app. So once you start monitoring an app, you can go to perfmon, and you'll see these 4 running. And what are they? They're average request time. That's on average for all the transactions flowing through your app. Monitored requests per second, load on the app. Percentage of those requests that are resulting in either a failure or a performance event. Now, obviously those are useful on their own, but you can also use them to set monitors here. So our assumption is, from an IT pro perspective, is you probably don't want to change the health state based on individual event occurrences, but rather averages. So you may apply a rule that says, you know what, I want to go into an error state when, on average, my users are going over 10 seconds. And then I want to dive into the alerts and see where the problems are. So you can describe those rules here, as you're seeing. And that applies to the application health overall. The last piece of the equation here, it gets back to your question. And there's a couple angles. So what if we want to target specific areas of the application and highlight those from an operational perspective, or apply different rules to them? The example I always give is one that I think exists for most business applications, is login. If our users can't log in, game over, right? Or it's really, really slow. From an operational perspective, you may want to have that highlighted, and you may want to see that individual transaction independent of the overall health itself. So the way we do that is we can set a web page, which would make sense for an ASP.NET app. It could be an individual web service. I just went through this with a customer who said, we got this one web service that we have vendors hitting and everyone hitting, right? And we need to highlight this independently. So you can do that here. Or it can even be a specific function. It could actually be not the page. It could just be the call to SQL Server to log in, if that's how you're doing authentication, if that makes sense. Now, I'll pick the easy route here, which is web page. We do have some utilities in here that will allow you, as an IT pro, to go out and pick a computer that's running in this case, the Ops Manager web console, and we'll go out and try and pull up a list of all the pages. If you don't have this, or for some reason it doesn't pull up, you can just give us the path to the page. But this is a nice, easy way, and it helps me pick login here. So there's our web console login. And when I do that, you're going to see the same thing we saw before. So here's where you're going to set different settings. And the other thing that you're going to get is performance counters specific to that transaction. So you will get, all right, let me see here, I can't even get down. I'll close it. You will get average request time, requests per second for login. So again, operationally and reporting-wise, you can actually report on that. So if you have some SLA around a key kind of business area of your application, you can actually track that. Just to tie it all together, I won't save that just because it'll take a little time. This is what you get at the conclusion of that process. Here we are. So what we have is we'll go out, we'll deploy the agents if the agents need to be deployed on the target. We'll deploy the configuration. We'll hook in and begin to monitor the application. And from an ops manager perspective, we'll build out these views dynamically for you. So you'll get a state summary view that you can see. Here's real-time load on the system, request per second. Here's real-time average request time for this app. Here's the health state for the application overall. And in this case, you see in Dinner Now, we have 3 transactions: registration, search, and cart. And so we can track those individually. As a matter of fact, those have their own dashboard specific for that business function. Any questions?
Yeah, I've got a
Question?
Oh, sorry.
Yours doesn't count.
Yeah, I forgive that. So, you mentioned a couple of different installation scenarios, and I'm curious about a couple. One would be installing the standalone,
Yep.
not operations managers, integrated
Okay.
version. In something like Amazon hosted Windows Server, SQL Server
Yep.
environment, or Rackspace, something like that, or Windows Azure and SQL Azure.
Yep.
Just curious about any qualifications about installation difficulties we might encounter.
Well, you know,
Yes, you may have difficulty.
it's possible,
There-
absolutely. Amazon's probably the easiest case, right? Because essentially all you're dealing with is a VM, right? So it works exactly the same. Azure, it's possible. We're actually, I can't give you a date. We're actually working on some guidance on how to do that. It is possible. It is forthcoming. It's doable now. It's just not exposed in a way that's easy for you to consume. So the answer is it's all possible. And there's hybrid models of that, right? I mean, you could just deploy an agent and report it back to your own infrastructure if you have some sort of secure connection, et cetera, et cetera. So there's options there.
Yeah, we hear the cloud's important, so we need to go there.
Okay.
One of the interesting points there is that we were asking earlier on about infrastructure and for developers. But through what Chris was showing us here, we can in fact appropriate the right alerts to the operations. Because we may not want to have all the developers on in there, but we can go, it's us, it's there. We don't even need to say that anymore. It's already there. They could be looking at the SE viewer, they can see the developer ones, and we can see the ones that affect us in the infrastructure. We've just taken away a massive argument
Yep.
and just made it a simplistic way to move forward.
Excellent. Yeah, good point, Simon. Thank you. That's exactly right. You know, we help have the correct communications in the company that we typically have to struggle through and work through. I worked for a company where there would be 10 or 15 of us in a room trying to mind meld and figure out what's going wrong. And we all had our own ideas of what was going wrong. None of our ideas were incorrect, but they might not have helped to solve the problem right away. And you know, we had to work through that. Sometimes that's the best way to solve a problem. It might be the only way, but we try to help by giving some information around that. So what Chris essentially told us was how to monitor the web server side of an application. Essentially, all he really did was tell us how to monitor, in particular, the component that creates the HTML and sends it out to a user. And that's the same steps and philosophy and approach you would take to monitor any of the other types of the architecture. So if you're talking about an N-tier application with a web service, same approach to get the web service. And we'll correlate that data because we'll see those communications. We also talk about what's going on with the end user. A long time ago, I presented all this great information to how to monitor a .NET application to a customer, and here's the Windows service and what it's doing. And he's like, I don't care if it's slow. I'm like, what? Why don't you care if it's slow? I always care if it's slow. And he goes, I don't care if it's slow. Only thing I care about is if it hurts my end users. If that takes 10 days, I don't care. Don't even know what it's doing. So I'm not 100% sure I agree with him at the moment in time. I needed a paycheck, so I did. But really, that does move the conversation out, really. When are you impacting an end user? That's the important thing. That's the alert I care about. And it's something near and dear to me, and I've actually been working in this space for a long time. And I think that's the real use case of understanding what's going on in my environment. When am I impacting an end user? And the end user, in some cases, could be another application. But what we're going to talk about here is probably the largest application coding infrastructure in the world, HTML, and monitoring that in the browser. So we do that by first doing what Chris did, deploying into the ASP.NET server side. We need that to take place. It's the first thing that has to happen. Second thing that has to happen is we have to install our collector component. So you run that MSI, copy some files over, and starts this configuration utility. And it says, here's the websites we see you're monitoring on this server. Which ones do you want to create a virtual directory under that's going to collect that extra bit of code or that extra bit of request when there's an unhealthy event? So you just check them off and hit apply, and it's going to make a virtual directory in IIS for you. Done. You've created the catcher's mitt for what we need. And again, you can actually deploy that anywhere you want. You can manually deploy it, install it however you want, copy the files. It's a service that's just acting as a catcher's mitt, but it has to have a local AVIcode agent on the system that you're deploying the collector to, because it uses the agent to communicate. Oh, sorry, question, yes. Good question. How many agents can that handle? Well, it's applications that it's monitoring. Don't really know. You know, the thought process is how happy are the applications, right? So it could probably monitor 100 happy applications, 1,000 happy applications. And if it's a really unhappy one, it might only be one that it throws it over the edge. So it would be probably requests per second that it can handle. And that number is kind of something we really haven't dug into yet. So can't really give a straight answer on that. Once we have the collector installed, what we have to actually do now is configure the injection point. Right? That's what we'll call it. I don't have another term for it. What that is simply saying, where are we going to put that JavaScript? We talk about not having to have an agent on the client side, an agent on the browser. We don't have to go install anything on a user's desktop. That's correct. But reality there is. That agent happens to be JavaScript that we inject into the HTML that's running in a user's browser. It's limited to a handful of browsers. It doesn't do things like Chrome and some of the web kits that are in your phones yet. I don't know when that is and where it is in the roadmap, but it doesn't do those. It's pretty standard in what it does do. It also has the ability now to collect some additional information in those browsers that it has access to. So dependent on the browser, it could bring things over like what images were downloaded. And I say depends on the browser because browsers are what runs the HTML. And we're simply hooking into the document object model of that browser and events in the browser and collecting data. And so when we configure that, we have to have that kind of understanding. What is it? What information do I want to come back to me? So you have that ability to check and select. Once the application's added to the server-side component, we can add it to the client-side component, and we use the UX monitoring console, which is automatically deployed with our server-side agent. And then we can select the server-side application that was being monitored and add it here. There's some gotchas that we're actually going to go through and talk about because this is one of the most manual processes that we have to configure monitoring. There's some reasons behind it. Mostly I say it's just the roadmap and timing that we didn't have. So let's kind of look at what takes place. So after you've got your UX collector installed on the system, thank you, sir. Somebody would have told me eventually. So after you've got the collector installed on your system, and again, you can run that collector configuration utility at any time. If I wanted to remove that virtual directory, I just rerun it, uncheck it, apply, and I'm done, and it takes that virtual directory off. So then you have to decide, okay, I want to hook into an application that System Center's already collecting data on. I've already seen that information come over. And then you go into the UX Management Console. And in the UX Management Console, simply right-click and say, I want to add a web application. You'll get a list of the applications that haven't been already configured. Then you can select that and continue the process. And it's going to do something here that's kind of a protection. There's a few steps that we try to protect the application from getting injected into the wrong types, let's say. For example, you don't want to inject JavaScript into an XML fragment for a web service of some kind, right? It's not going to run anywhere and it's going to make that an ugly script. So we do this scan to kind of look at what's there. And the scan will come up with some warnings sometimes all green. Really doesn't matter what it says when it comes down to are you going to monitor it or not. That's really your decision process. So what I mean is, if it came up and it said, I was hoping there was a yellow one that would pop up, but if it came up and it said, you can't monitor this or you might have difficulty here and it had a warning, it says, actually I'm going to try to find one that says that because I think that that's important. It'll actually come up and say that, do you want to fix? Do you want to fix this problem? And in reality, you don't want to fix the problem, because the fix is not to monitor. So again, the scanner runs. We've got that one. There it is. I've got my one warning. It's telling me something to do with the page content. If I wanted to, I could actually try to understand it and see if there's a fix we can talk about doing. But what it's looking at is the code and the way it's going to compile the page and the HTML, and it gives us the warning and says why. In most cases, it's a warning. It tells you where the warning actually comes out of, in this particular case, the master pages. And if I clicked resolve, it looks pretty cool. Looks like it's going to run out and go fix that problem for me, right? Nope, it's just not going to monitor the app. That's how we resolve that problem. So in this case, I'm going to say, go ahead and monitor the app. I do want it to do that. So I'm going to hit close that scanner. It's going to ask me again, are you sure you don't want to monitor, or you want to continue and monitor this app? Yeah, I'm sure. So I'm going to hit close. I'm not going to hit disable and close. We're being kind of redundant in our questions and answers around that because, again, it's important not to put JavaScript into things that it's not capable of running, right? It's just going to blow some other things up. Then it gets listed, and we can go in now and set some of the different criteria we have. And this is where, well, if you can't tell, I occasionally have a soapbox, and this is one of my soapboxes that I'm going to pull out and give everybody. Everybody in the world says to me, not all my pages are equal. Some pages are going to take longer than other pages, and I'm okay with that. Doesn't matter with what you're okay with. Matters what your customers are okay with. Right? I'll beat that home all the time. Years and years ago when I first got into this space, monitoring the user in the browser and what's going on, we were always doing testing and trying to understand what's the average response time. I want to keep that average. I want to be right around. I want a baseline. We had all these terms. The reality is what can end users expect? And what's their perception versus reality of it, right? And there was a lot of testing done, and the test I still think holds the same as today. The average human waits about 10 seconds before they start tapping their finger and getting ticked off. It's that simple. That's your metric. Take somebody like Chris, it's 5 seconds. But we're going to work on the averages. I don't have enough beer to keep him happy. So There's some thought process you have to have here. Overall, you need to set your default. Will you have reports you don't want to alert and come in and give you these warnings and wake people up in the middle of the night? Yes, you will go in and you will configure those. But overall, set that default to where you want to collect data and where you want to have that information come in. And have that default manage as much as it can and limit what you're filtering and changing later, right? The other thing you need to be concerned about is what did you set the server side to record as? If you're taking the 10-second approach like I preach, the server side shouldn't be 10 seconds. Shouldn't be 15. Should probably be half, right? Your expectation should be that the server can respond to that request in at least half the time it takes for the browser to make the request and render the request. So you should probably be somewhere around 5 on the server if you're taking that approach. If the server's relying on other services to talk to the database and do things, how many times does it usually talk to that other service? If it talks to it twice or 3 times, you might want to set it down to 1 second or 2 seconds. The services are supposed to be faster. So I know, I get on my soapbox just because I can, and they actually gave me a real big one, so that's what I use it for. So here, that's what you're going to do, is you're going to set your page loading thresholds. You're going to set your sensitivity thresholds. If you're in a testing scenario and you're a developer, go ahead and put it at 0 and collect every page and generate a nice report. What's the average? And you'll get some really cool statistics and information. The thing that you have to be concerned about, because we really don't want to inject JavaScript if it's not going to be right. The things you have to be concerned about are the filters where we actually do something here that's kind of unique. We break the injection. So no matter what I configured everywhere else, and I go ahead and turn it on and collect and say, okay, I've got everything done, you actually come up to this point and we break the injection. We say, don't inject that JavaScript into certain browsers. Don't inject it into requests that are ASMX or services. Don't inject to these other types of requests. And the gotcha that everybody runs into, and I do it today, I do installs and I forget. The gotcha that everybody runs into is we also have this one that says deny everything in between 0 and 255 for an IP address. Happens to be everybody, right? Best practice is, if you're putting this into production, remove the deny filter for everything except 127.0.0.1. Test it. See if you see the JavaScript and the page render the way you want. Then put it into an intranet where you could go to your workstation and test the app. You can make the app live. It doesn't matter. People could be using it and they're not going to get it injected. Then you can come back and you can actually remove this once you've performed a few tests. And then the injection happens. So at this point, I'm already monitoring the server. I'm already collecting on the server. I simply told it to now start injecting that application. And the way that you could quickly test to see if it's actually getting it, we're going to go back out to the application Chris used. And I'm going to click on a blank spot, pull up the source code of the HTML, and very quickly, I'm familiar with it, and you will become familiar with it. All this really cool looking stuff is what we just injected into that page that attaches to the DOM. And the reason that you might be able to recognize it is we're talking to that collector, which is the web service. It's a virtual directory. Identifier for the server that injected it? Yes. So when you look at a client-side script, a failure from a page rendering slow, inside the SE viewer or inside Operations Manager, we're going to tell you, here's your response time. And we're actually going to tell you the server name that responded to that request. Yeah. Better yet, not only are we going to tell you the server name, we're going to show you what the server's response time was to build that. And if the server broke its SLA, and here it goes back to my 10.5.2 speech, I can give it again if we need to. Zoom. Thank you, Chris. Thank you. So now what we're looking at is that overall timing, right? And it's telling us what the server was. If I did my 10.5.2 correctly, and the server broke that 2-second timing, I'll get my distributed chain that will actually show me the server in the middle actually was recorded. I collected the data from the server. And then my 1-second response time was broken on the web services I talked to, so now I got my web services. So if I go all the way over to the web service, the slowest web service is collected. It's there. I'm sorry, guys, in the database arena, but in this case, it is SQL. It is. It's link developed query, so it was automatically generated, and that possibly is it. I'll go with that. Probably not, but I'll go with it. So this is interesting, too, because, you know, let's face it, I sold this for a living. I don't anymore. I just kind of teach about it. And this is where everybody would get up and start running down the hall and screaming for the checkbook. Because no matter who you are, we just took a poor performing web page, the guy's calling and saying it broke 10 seconds, tapping his fingers and complaining, all the way down to something we can test without that big 15-person Vulcan mind meld. Not that I didn't mind it, because the coffee was free and the donuts were stale, but reality is we just got rid of that conversation on this particular incident. We've ruled out a large number of the incidents in a lot of organizations where they've had to have those conversations. We didn't rule them all out, because humans still need to come into play. They wrote the apps, they manage the servers. We're just taking a big chunk of them. And one of the things that this is an ideal situation, we're walking through an install of probably an application environment that's configured ideally for this process. Let's say, for example, we develop on the fringe. Some things might not be, as easy to do the configurations and installs. So this is another process we also have to learn and gain that knowledge base about and have subject matters. Yes?
Simple question for you on this screen that you got up here. So you've got the tree view of all the events and it's got the times by it. Yeah, right there. So the root level one, the top level one is 1634 milliseconds. The bottom one, the one that's highlighted in red, is 1629. Am I interpreting right that the whole tree took 1634 milliseconds and the offender took 1629 of those 1634?
That's exactly right. So the question is, how does that tree break down time-wise? And that's exactly right. It kind of bubbles up, right? So you're looking at the 1634 is made up of the underlying methods or functions that broke the sensitivity level. So that's exactly how it looks. You can see, as I hover over it, it says that this particular method took 1633 milliseconds, and it was no self-time. So everything underneath it made up that 633. So as you hover over each one, it'll tell you what's called self-time when you get all the way down to the bottom. Self-time would be, for a developer's perspective, if you put some loop into a function or some recursive component that does something while it's talking to something else, right? So, or it's basically time that wasn't recorded because the configuration said don't record that and don't care about that. As developers, one of the things you don't see in this stack is a profile, right? You don't see the system.webform.buttonRenderer class took 0.1 microseconds.
Well, the other way that I was looking at it potentially is that each line item didn't take that long and was for some reason that last one flagged because of the configuration. So I didn't know which way to go on.
So it's a very good question, because the configuration, and we'll talk about this in one of our other sessions, is how to diagnose and make changes and do some of these things. If you install the way that Chris walked you through the install process for the server, it will look like that. It's a pretty important distinction. Do we still get the SQL stuff? Yeah, you'll see the SQL stuff, and you'll see how many, and you'll see link. What you won't see are these additional namespaces, and the developers are always going to ask for them. So the IT pros that put this information into Ops Manager, and you start collecting this data, one of the very first things you're going to do is start sending emails to the developers, probably a lot. One of the very first things they're going to come back if you send this to them is going, that's pretty cool, but that's not enough. So there are some other configurations and advanced configurations which we can get into. Time-wise, we do have a couple of minutes. Yeah, good. So let's talk about that because that's important. One of the things, again, back to my subject matter expert comment, one of the things that we need to develop internally when we deploy AVIcode and Operations Manager in general or separately, doesn't matter. We need to have the knowledge base around what did we deploy, how do we change it, how do we configure it. Because if developers are coming to the SE viewer, seeing a lot of stuff and trying to solve a lot of problems, they might need to make some changes to get more detail or to have a different conversation. We'll get the low-hanging fruit out of the way, but then there's going to be other stuff we need to diagnose. So there are some configuration changes. One of the configuration changes and the terms that come up is namespaces and assemblies. These are developer terms. But basically, when they wrote Dinner Now application, they wrote this namespace called Dinner Now. It's an assembly that's inside of the code that's doing stuff. Well, to be interesting and helpful, you have to add that namespace. That's what your custom developers wrote, or your developers' custom code they wrote. That'll help them so that they can follow that execution tree. Again, if we were really looking for this particular incident, you would have got the SQL statement in the same view here, and you'd know where to go. But the developers wouldn't know because this is dynamically created SQL. They wouldn't know that it was the get menus types that did it. And they wouldn't be able to report on that function like here. I can go in and see the heaviest resource is the select statement and group it by the operation that called it. So I know that get menu types is the developer's function that called that SQL. And it was the exact same SQL every time, and it was slow 17 times, and it averaged 2.5 seconds roughly. So to get that to happen, in Operations Manager, it's fairly simple. It's something that you have to be aware of. You don't want to do this in a production environment. The more data we collect, the more resources we utilize to save it and store it and send it, right? So you want to make sure what's the impact before you put it into production. Once you get to that point, while viewing the application, here I'm just looking at the health state. Everything's green, everything's good, really don't. In Operations Manager, I can go to the Actions menu, select my application, and what you're going to see is Enable Performance Diagnostics Data. Give you the Reader's Digest version of it, and trust me, these terms and definitions get a lot easier now that we're in the big machine and it's creating and correcting. That means enable all namespaces. So when you're looking at that execution tree, we clicked on that so that we got the Dinner Now stuff. It's not going to turn on for the developers in the audience. All the other stuff we have disabled. So system.web.form.button renderer, whatever, it's not going to enable those. It's not going to override what's disabled. But it's going to enable all these new ones that they may do. The reason you want to be leery of doing this in production is this directly impacts how many things we're thinking about as we're waiting on a page to be slow or not. Right? Because we have to hold these namespaces and go, okay, let me think about that. Nope, it was fast, I'll throw that out. Right? So that's one reason. The other reason is when we're looking at that very large namespace and you have code that's purchased third party or the Telerik controls, the Infragistics controls that we might buy and borrow, you don't know how those things are written. Very large namespaces, and if you enable all namespaces, you're adding thousands of lines of information being collected for no reason at all because you can't change it. So you want to be specific about what's going on before you just do this in a production app.
The icons next to where you have the mouse pointer. So right now, what's the state? Is it disabled or enabled?
In this particular case, we don't bring that back to the configuration or to the screen to show you if it's enabled or disabled. You'd simply have to say what you want it to be, make the checkbox. You can click disable to turn it off. The only way to really see what the state is to look inside of an event. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It looks like in 5.7, that's what they did. It says exception diagnostics data is being collected. I don't see performance diagnostics data. Yep. Yep, there they are. So they're both enabled. Yep. So the actions don't actually trigger a change based on what's configured. The other way to actually change that, and the way that developers will want to play with it a little bit, and even an operations IT pro I want to play with it, is through the management console snap-in. And the only reason I say that is, again, it's about subject matter experts, right? We need to understand what's excluded, why is it not being collected, what is being collected. We need to have the knowledge base, right? So go into the management console of a system that has it deployed. And this is where you would configure it if you did it separate. If you did it outside of Operations Manager. Operations Manager installs this in 5.7. So now I can go into the properties of web applications, and I can see how it was configured default to do all web applications. And I can see what namespaces have been enabled. And since we clicked on that Enable Diagnostics, that line was added. Everything in the list you see, everything in the list you see is disabled just because it was noisy information that you can't do anything about, so we didn't want to show it inside of a performance event.
So if you did that, like you mentioned some of the third-party things, so let's just say that you're using an logistics control and you've got it on a development site configured in a bad way or just using a bad pattern. If you had that enabled, would you be able to see that layer in their namespaces basically performing badly? So you know either A, they wrote bad performing code, or B, we're doing something bad from how
Yeah.
we're using the stuff.
Yeah, funny you should ask that. One of the hardest diagnostics, I guess, engagement I had was a customer that was using one of those third-party controls. I'm not going to mention their names because they're good friends of ours. But they were using one of these third-party controls. And as a developer, if you don't know what they do, when you put stuff in, you don't know what the result is. And in this particular case, based on what was going into the grid, and they were using one of those bright and shiny new grids, and those are awesome things, each grid had what they expected were 100 lines or 100 columns, but what they didn't expect was a user was going to actually make it thousands of lines worth of. And for every cell, the grid did a test on one of the strings going in and automatically failed. Every single cell, there was an exception. So you multiplied that out, it was thousands of exceptions per second, and it just brought it to its knees. It was only for specific data that was entered. So the answer is yes. We would find that. It would help you do that. That brings a server to its knees in large implementations. It's not something the developers would do on purpose. It's stuff you bought and you don't know what's under the covers. So we could do that. We would bring that information out and report on that. Allows you to filter out or filter in namespaces. Exactly right. Yeah, matter of fact, the list, if you look, not that I'm going to highlight anybody in particular, but Infodristics is already disabled. Telereq is not, but probably should be. Just, yes?
So, when you make changes in the MMC on an agent, does it require an IIS reset? Or an old version?
So the question is, does making changes to how we're monitoring an app require an IIS reset? In some cases. To monitor an app, yes. To start monitoring, we won't monitor until it's turned off and starts up. In web apps, that's W3WP, so that's the other applications. They simply are the executables. Some things only require an app pull recycle. But for the most part, major changes in namespaces, other than the alerting and sensitivity, are restarts. So I know we're coming up to the conclusion. I think we've burned all of our time except for 24 seconds, because when they open the door, that means Sean, shut up. So if there's no other questions, I want to thank you all for coming. That's great. A lot of great questions, and I really appreciate it, and I can see that it's going to be used in good health. So.
And we'll stay up here for a few more minutes if people have questions. And please do give us feedback. Hopefully this was useful for you. But fill out the
Thanks, I appreciate it.